Hello. Recently, the term XDR has become popular, and I wanted to explain how Event Tracker managed threat protection services offered by Netsurian compares with this newfangled term called XDR. So here's what we're going to cover. First of all, what is XDR anyway, and where did it come from? What might be some features and capabilities of a solution that purports to be XDR? Why is it useful? How does XDR become meaningful in our security universe? What is the architecture that would be necessary to support an XDR? And this is a view provided by an analyst firm by the name of Gartner. What sorts of benefits does XDR bring you as a user? And then, of course, how specifically does the Netsurian Event Tracker Managed Threat Protection Services map to these other things? So first of all, what exactly is XDR? Well, the X in XDR stands for extended, and it's extended detection and response. And it comes from the word EDR, which was endpoint detection and response. And so if you just have EDR, XDR is above and beyond that. It's mostly there to centralize threat tooling. After all, our primary mission is to look for threats to IT security against all of our assets and therefore gain greater control. When you say XDR and you say this is beyond just EDR, what does beyond EDR mean? Well, it also includes, for example, network traffic analysis. It integrates threat intelligence. It has machine learning based detection. It does orchestration for investigation response. And then the deployment is dynamic, meaning more than one set of tools can be deployed as and when necessary. Notice that a component of XDR is EDR, and so XDR is above and beyond plain old EDR. The idea here is that whereas EDR focuses on the endpoint, XDR has a broader field of view. In addition to the endpoint, also the network, maybe stuff that you have in the cloud. Do you have M365? Do you have Azure? Do you have AWS? And those kinds of components as well. Also included in XDR is analytics and automation. And then, of course, the fact that XDR is proactive, trying to get ahead of the curve instead of being reactive, which is what a lot of EDR is really focused on. So that's what XDR is. So where did this thing really come from? Well, it came from the fact that security teams have a mission. They are, after all, the blue team defending the network, trying to identify sophisticated or partially hidden threats. And that their purview is not just the endpoint, but is more than the endpoint. It includes what's going on in the network from the firewall perspective, the wireless access point perspective, the website perspective, maybe also the cloud if you happen to have assets there. And security teams are always being asked to improve the detection and do things faster. The bad guys have increased their velocity, and so also the good guys, that is to say the blue team, must be able to do that. Last but not the least, given all of these different screens, given all of these different places in the network, it's always a clear thing to try to investigate more effectively. The more panes of glass you got to see, the more it slows you down as an analyst. So XDR really came from, or evolved, if you like, from these standalone tools. I mean, we always had EDR, or at least had it for several years, strictly focused on the endpoint. You had network traffic analysis, snort and things like that, looking strictly at the network layer. The fact of the matter is these layer specific tools are great, but they offer limited visibility. They see everything from strictly their point of view. And often you want to know things that start in one place, maybe wound up in the other. So an attack begins on premise as it did in Hafnium and then eventually migrated to the cloud and then began to spread over there against all of your assets. So layer specific tools tend to be narrow in their vision. Therefore, this means you need to think about more alerts, more effort, less correlation. So there are three fundamental features that are thought to be important in XDR. Let's look at them. First, from the analytics and detection point of view, XDR wants to think about both internal and external traffic. Why so? Because sometimes you have threats that begin in the inside because your credentials got compromised. You really think that's John logging in, do all of these things? No, because John's credentials were in fact stolen. We saw this happen again and again in various networks. Another aspect of XDR is to integrate threat intelligence. From our perspective, good threat intelligence occurs at multiple levels. You have stuff occurring globally, which of course the feeds can tell you about inside the event tracker community, as well as local to your particular network. What are the attack methods? What are the tactics? What are the techniques? This is what an XDR solution must have in the analytics and detection bucket. And of course, machine learning based detection, simply because there is such a lot of traffic, such a lot of activity going on, that there is no way a human, even if they are dedicated to your particular asset or set of assets, can possibly stay on top of. And so unsupervised anomaly detection is a foundational element in XDR. The ability to detect non-traditional threats above and beyond what the signature based stuff would do. The second feature of XDR is around a bucket called investigation and response. And this is to take all of those alerts that you saw in the previous slide from the various places and then correlate them. Maybe put them in a timeline that's tied to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, prioritize them so that we can see what's more important, what's less important, maybe based on asset value, maybe based on severity of threat. Another element of investigation and response is to have the proverbial single pane of glass. The fewer of these panes of glass you have to actually look at, the more likely it is that your analyst is going to get to be able to get on top of the problem quicker. And then orchestration of response. If you see something, don't just say something, do something. This is what we've been told often. So if you can orchestrate response, why then that is a facility that's part of XDR. Notice that the response now must also be beyond the endpoint, whereas EDR provided orchestration at the endpoint. XDR must provide orchestration across all of those assets. Maybe the fix is in the cloud, maybe the fix is in the network device, not just the endpoint. The third feature of XDR is dynamic deployment. And what do we mean by this? Well, first of all, we mean that the solution must improve over time. Like any reasonable machine language or machine learning solution, you must realize what's going on and change yourself. Of course, unsupervised anomaly detection does just this, because the thresholds for alerting might be different based over the weekend versus the weekday, maybe in the summer versus the normal fall if you're a school, maybe on after hours versus within hours if you're a financial kind of institution. So you want to not just adapt, but you also want to improve over time as you learn the characteristics of a network. Dynamic deployment also means that your storage and compute must be elastic. This can only really happen if you're using cloud resources, right? If you're on premise, then there is a ceiling as to how much RAM, memory, disk, CPU you can press into play. But then if you're hosted in the cloud, these things can be elastic, and that's another feature of XDR. Last but not the least, when we say dynamic deployment, XDR must provide some sort of unified and standardized response. Maybe you do this by having a playbook and encourage the use of playbooks across all of the organizations that are participating, encourage the use of automation. That then were the three major buckets and features of XDR solutions. So where would you use XDR? Well, first of all, XDR can be extremely helpful in triage. Investigating teams are busy trying to write detections and try and identify stuff from that mass of things that look innocent so that you can detect and thereby alert. Having alerted, of course, you must then investigate. And XDR can enable this by leveraging the threat intel repo. I mean, I'm assuming that as part of XDR, there is a threat intelligence platform and it has all of the information, the different indicators of compromise that you are aware of, whether it's global or it's community or it's local, and that is available to be leveraged. And of course, another use case for XDR is to hunt threats. Nice to have anomaly detection, nice to have static alerting, but the fact is there are known unknowns. And so do you go into the jungle with a knife like Rambo, hunting for threats. What's been overlooked by anomaly detection? XDR can be extremely helpful for threat hunting teams. So if you do have XDR above and beyond EDR, what benefits might you accrue? Well, first of all, your prevention gets a whole lot better. And remember, the adaptive model says that you predict where possible, you prevent as much as you can, failing which, of course, you must have detection and response. So if you can prevent the threat, you're ahead of the game. Well, with the adaptive machine learning and the integration of threat intelligence, you can trigger with XDR continuous monitoring with automated response. This really improves prevention defenses above and beyond what just a plain old EDR at the endpoint might do. You get much better visibility if you have XDR. How so? Well, remember, your scope is a lot broader. It's not just the endpoint, but it's also the network. It's also behaviors of users. And remember, users can be compromised, so they may not be who you think they are. And also visibility across the board, not just the on-premise or the endpoint stuff. Sometimes it's not on-premise, but it's at home, especially in COVID. But we call that endpoint or on-premise, but also assets that might be in your cloud for much better visibility. Your response can get a whole lot better. You can trace the attack path because it started on premise, it jumped to the cloud or the other direction. You can reconstruct attacker actions. This is very helpful in trying to identify the location of the attacker and adapting your defense. We saw this specifically with Hafnium against on-premise Exchange servers, as well as Solorigate against the SolarWinds stuff in late 2020. You get greater control with XDR. You can tailor the block and the allow lists, not just to the endpoint, but also to the cloud, also to the network devices. And this can enable you in terms of better prevention. And then last but not the least, your security teams will have better productivity because there are fewer screens and because the alerts can in fact be correlated. So as you can see, XDR provides you a number of benefits above and beyond just the plain old EDR. So how does NetSurian's architecture compare to the one proposed by Gartner for a typical XDR? Well, at the very top layer are the sources of data into this solution. And as you can see, the managed threat protection can gather data from our own EDR, our own endpoint protection services, or maybe a third party from the cloud. These days, it tends to be M365, maybe from web servers that are hosting your stuff, from whatever components you're using in the public cloud, maybe Azure, maybe AWS. IAM devices, these days it tends to be on-premise or Azure Active Directory or some hybrid. Information from the vulnerability scanner, and of course, network devices. There are many more that I didn't list here, just dot, dot, dot. What happens in our XDR architecture is all of this gets normalized via the common indexing model. So regardless of the model of the firewall, is it a Cisco, is it a Palo Alto, regardless of the way in which you're doing two-factor authentication, is it an RSA, is it Okta, is it something else, regardless of whether you're using Azure or using AWS, and they report different things in different ways, different operating systems, all of this gets normalized via the common indexing model and put into the data lake. In our universe, the data lake is realized using Elasticsearch. And this is what allows us to correlate without having to know the specifics of your particular make and model. This is what our XDR architecture looks like. And this basically enables our 24/7 SOC. This allows us to provide you incident response, to provide you automation, and to provide you workflow as well. API is something that we've been working on and we will be releasing shortly in 2021. And so NetSurian MTP, surprise, surprise, does in fact provide XDR capabilities. If you go back to the beginning and ask yourself the question, what were the components of an XDR and does NetSurian's MTP services have it? The answer is yes. After all, MTP includes network traffic analysis via network traffic analyzer, integrated threat intelligence, courtesy the Event Tracker Threat Center, machine learning based detection has been incorporated in core Event Tracker since version 7. We're at version 9.3 at the moment. Investigation response orchestration is from our SOC, which operates 24/7. Of course, dynamic deployment. We're happy to host this in the cloud, and so that all of the elements can be elastic. NetSurian's MTP services provide visibility across not just the endpoint, but also the network and also the cloud. It includes analytics and automation and is proactive. Accordingly, I'm happy to tell you that the NetSurian MTP services are in fact an XDR. Thank you for your attention.